A chilling discovery in the heart of an otherwise quiet town has left a community in shock and a police force scrambling for answers. A beloved female teacher, a pillar of her community, has been found dead, her body discovered in the most bizarre and macabre of circumstances resting on the bucket of an excavator. The initial whispers of a tragic accident have quickly given way to a darker, more sinister narrative. What secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of this idyllic town? What series of events could have possibly led to such a horrifying end? The truth is often more terrifying than fiction, and in this case, it's a truth that will unravel a web of secrets, lies, and betrayals that will shake this community to its very core. Before we delve into the heart of this mystery, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single, chilling detail as we uncover the horrifying truth behind this tragedy. The quaint town of Oak Ridge was a patchwork of manicured lawns, white picket fences, and the kind of comforting predictability that lulled its residents into a sense of unwavering security. It was a town where the most exciting news was the annual bake sale at the community center, and the most pressing concern was the friendly rivalry between the high school football teams. But on a crisp October morning, as the autumn leaves painted the town in hues of amber and gold, a darkness descended upon Oak Ridge, a darkness that would forever stain the town's picturesque facade. Her name was Amelia Collins, and she was the heart and soul of Oak Ridge Elementary. At 35, she possessed a passion for teaching that was as infectious as her radiant smile. Her classroom was a sanctuary of creativity and learning, a place where her students felt seen, heard, and valued. She was more than just a teacher. She was a confidant, a mentor, and a guiding light in the lives of the children she so adored. Her dedication to her students was matched only by her love for the town she called home. She was a fixture at community events, a friendly face in the local grocery store, and a beloved neighbor to all who knew her. But there was another side to Amelia, a side that few people in Oak Ridge were privy to. She was a woman of quiet complexities, a woman who carried a weight in her heart that was belied by her cheerful demeanor. She was a woman who, in the quiet moments of her life, felt a profound sense of loneliness, a longing for a connection that had always seemed just out of her reach. She was a woman who, despite being surrounded by the love and adoration of her students and her community, often felt like an outsider looking in. The first sign that something was amiss was on a Monday morning when Amelia failed to show up for school. It was a departure from her impeccable record of punctuality, a deviation from the routine that was as jarring as a discordant note in a perfectly composed symphony. A call to her home went unanswered, and a visit to her charming little cottage on the edge of town revealed an empty house, a half-eaten breakfast on the kitchen table, and a sense of unease that hung heavy in the air. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary eyes had seen the underbelly of life in the big city before he had sought refuge in the tranquility of Oak Ridge, felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had known Amelia for years, had come to admire her for her unwavering dedication and her genuine kindness. The thought of her being in any kind of trouble was a thought he was not prepared to entertain. The search for Amelia began immediately, a frantic and desperate effort that saw the entire town come together in a show of unity and concern. They combed the dense woods that bordered the town. They searched the winding country roads. They called her name until their voices were hoarse, but their efforts were in vain. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a void that was filled with a growing sense of fear and desperation. It was on the third day of the search that the horrifying discovery was made. A construction worker, on his way to a remote site on the outskirts of town, stumbled upon a scene that would forever be seared into his memory. There, in the cold, metallic embrace of an excavator's bucket, lay the lifeless body of Amelia Collins. The news of her death sent a shockwave through Oak Ridge, a wave of grief and disbelief that was followed by a torrent of questions. The initial assumption, the one that everyone clung to in a desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless, was that it was a tragic accident. Perhaps she had been out for a walk and had fallen, a cruel and unforgiving twist of fate. But as the details of the scene began to emerge, the theory of an accident began to crumble. Her body was positioned in a way that suggested it had been placed there, and the cause of death, A single, devastating blow to the back of the head was a clear indication of foul play. The horrifying truth was that Amelia Collins had been murdered. The town of Oak Ridge, once a haven of peace and tranquility, was now a community consumed by fear and suspicion. The once friendly smiles of neighbors were now replaced by guarded glances, and the once familiar streets now seemed to hold a sinister secret. The horrifying truth behind Amelia's death was a mystery that had to be solved, not just to bring a killer to justice, but to restore the sense of security that had been so brutally shattered. The echo of a life unlived was a constant and painful reminder of what they had lost, and the search for the truth was a journey that would take them into the darkest corners of the human heart. The murder of Amelia Collins was a wound that festered in the heart of Oak Ridge, a wound that refused to heal. The initial shock had given way to a pervasive sense of fear, a fear that was fueled by the anemic progress of the investigation. Sheriff Brody and his small team were working around the clock, but the case was a frustrating jigsaw puzzle with too many missing pieces. The crime scene had yielded no forensic evidence, and there were no witnesses to the crime. It was as if the killer had been a ghost, leaving behind nothing but a trail of grief and unanswered questions. As the investigation stalled, the rumor mill in Oak Ridge began to churn with a feverish intensity. Theories, ranging from the plausible to the preposterous, were whispered in hushed tones in the town's diner and debated in hushed conversations over backyard fences. The town was a tinderbox of speculation, and every new piece of information was like a spark that threatened to ignite a wildfire of accusations and innuendo. The first person of interest to emerge from the shadows of the investigation was a man named Richard, a local contractor with a reputation for being a hothead and a bully. He had been a vocal opponent of a new community garden project that Amelia had been championing, a project that would have put a halt to his plans to develop the land for commercial use. The two had had a public and acrimonious argument just days before her death, and Richard had been heard making a veiled threat against her. When questioned by Brody, Richard was defensive and uncooperative, his alibi for the night of the murder flimsy and unsubstantiated. He was a man with a motive and a temper, a man who seemed capable of violence. But there was no concrete evidence to link him to the crime, nothing to tie him to the scene of Amelia's death. He was a convenient suspect, an easy target for the town's anger and frustration, but Brody knew that convenience was not the same as guilt. And then, a new and unexpected lead emerged, a lead that would send the investigation in a direction that no one had anticipated. While sifting through Amelia's personal belongings, her journals, her emails, her financial records, a different picture of her life began to take shape. The image of the universally adored teacher began to fade, replaced by the portrait of a woman who was living a secret life, a life that was far more complicated and fraught with danger than anyone had ever imagined. Amelia, it turned out, had been involved in a clandestine online relationship with a man she had never met in person. Their correspondence, a mix of passionate declarations of love and desperate pleas for financial assistance, painted a picture of a woman who was being manipulated and exploited. She had sent the man thousands of dollars over the course of several months, money that she had taken out in loans, money that she could not afford to lose. The man, who went by the name of David, was a master of deception, a predator who had preyed on Amelia's loneliness and her desire for a connection. He had created a fictional persona, a sob story of a life filled with hardship and tragedy, and he had used it to bleed her dry. When Amelia had finally realized that she was being scammed, she had threatened to go to the police to expose him for the fraud that he was. The investigation now had a new focus, a new suspect, a man who was a ghost in the machine, a faceless and nameless entity who had a clear motive for wanting Amelia silenced. The task of tracking him down was a daunting one, a search for a needle in a digital haystack. But Brody and his team were determined to find him, to bring him out of the shadows and into the harsh light of justice. The town of Oak Ridge was now a community in turmoil. The revelation of Amelia's secret life was a shock to the system, a betrayal of the image they had held of her. The once unwavering adoration they had felt for her was now tinged with a sense of disappointment and confusion. They had been so sure that they knew her, but they had only known the version of her that she had wanted them to see. The unraveling of Amelia's perfect life had exposed a vulnerability that had made her a target. The horrifying truth behind her death was not just about who had killed her, but about the secrets she had kept, the secrets that had ultimately led to her demise. The search for her killer was now a race against time, a race to find a man who had no face, no name, and no conscience. The town of Oak Ridge was about to learn that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones you can't see. The search for the elusive David was a frustrating and painstaking process. The digital trail he had left behind was a labyrinth of fake profiles, encrypted messages, and dead ends. It was clear that he was a professional, a man who knew how to cover his tracks, a man who had likely done this before. But Sheriff Brody and his team were relentless, their determination fueled by the memory of Amelia and the desire to bring her killer to justice. They enlisted the help of a cybersecurity expert, a young and brilliant woman who was a master of the digital world. She spent days, and then weeks, poring over the data, following the breadcrumbs, slowly but surely piecing together the digital puzzle that David had so carefully constructed. And then a breakthrough. A single, careless mistake, a moment of digital hubris, had led them to a real name, a real location, a real person. The man's name was Alex, and he was not the charismatic and sophisticated man he had pretended to be online. He was a small-time con artist, a man who lived in a cramped and cluttered apartment in a rundown part of the city, a man whose life was a testament to his failures and his desperation. When Brody and his team kicked in his door, they found him huddled in front of his computer, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and surprise. First, Alex denied everything. He was a pathological liar, a man who was so used to living in a world of his own creation that he seemed to have lost his grip on reality. But as the evidence mounted against him, as the digital noose tightened around his neck, he began to crack. And then, in a flood of tears and self-pity, he confessed. He had been the one who had been scamming Amelia, the one who had taken her money and her trust. He had been the one who had panicked when she had threatened to go to the police, the one who had realized that his comfortable and lucrative charade was about to come to an end. But he swore that he had not killed her. He was a con artist, not a murderer. He had never even been to Oak Ridge. His alibi was solid, backed up by surveillance footage and a string of witnesses. He had been in the city, miles away from Oak Ridge, on the night of Amelia's death. He was a liar and a thief, a man who had played a role in the tragedy. But he was not the one who had delivered the fatal blow. The investigation was back to square one, the promising lead a dead end, the hope that had been building now replaced by a sense of frustration and despair. But Brody had a nagging feeling that he was missing something, that the answer was right in front of him, hidden in plain sight. He decided to go back to the beginning, to the one piece of the puzzle that had always seemed out of place. The excavator. He couldn't shake the feeling that the location of Amelia's body was not random, that it was a message, a clue that he had yet to decipher. He began to dig into the history of the construction site, the ownership of the land, the people who had worked there. And that's when he found it. A connection, a link that he had overlooked, a piece of information that would change everything. And the man who had been operating the excavator, the man who had been the last person to use it before it had been left at the site, was Richard's son, a quiet and withdrawn young man named Thomas. When Brody brought Thomas in for questioning, the young man was a picture of fear and anxiety. He was a boy who had lived his life in the shadow of his overbearing and abusive father, a boy who was used to being invisible, a boy who was carrying a terrible secret. And then, the story came tumbling out, a story of a tragic and unintentional accident, a story of a young man's desperate attempt to protect his father. Thomas had been at the construction site on the night of Amelia's death, working late, trying to impress the father who was never satisfied. He had been a witness to the argument between his father and Amelia, an argument that had escalated, an argument that had ended with his father, in a fit of rage, shoving Amelia to the ground. It had been a single, impulsive act, an act of violence that had had devastating and unforeseen consequences. Amelia had fallen backward, her head hitting the edge of the excavator bucket with a sickening crack. Richard had panicked, his rage replaced by a cold and calculated fear. He had told his son to stay quiet, to forget what he had seen, to be a good son and protect his family. And Thomas, out of a twisted sense of loyalty and a lifetime of fear, had done as he was told. He had helped his father move Amelia's body, placing it in the excavator bucket, a macabre and desperate attempt to make it look like an accident. He had lived with the weight of that secret for weeks, the guilt and the fear eating away at him, a silent and unwilling accomplice to his father's crime. The horrifying truth was a truth that was born of a father's rage and a son's misplaced loyalty. It was a truth that was far more tragic and complex than the town of Oak Ridge could have ever imagined. Richard was arrested, his facade of a respectable businessman shattered, his true nature as a violent and manipulative man exposed. And Thomas, a victim in his own right, was given a lighter sentence, a chance to rebuild his life, a chance to escape the shadow of his father's darkness. The town of Oak Ridge was a community that had been forever changed by the tragedy. The idyllic innocence that had once defined them had been lost, replaced by a more sober and realistic understanding of the world. The horrifying truth behind the death of the female teacher on the excavator bucket was a story that would be told for generations to come, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most perfect of lives, a story about the devastating consequences of a single, impulsive act and the unbearable weight of a shared secret. The trial of Richard captivated Oak Ridge, pulling the town's fragile seams apart. It was no longer a simple matter of a beloved teacher and her monstrous killer. The courtroom became a theater where the town's hidden biases and long-held allegiances played out in the open. On one side were those who saw Amelia as a saint, a martyr whose memory was being sullied by the defense's tactics. On the other were Richard's allies, powerful figures in the community who had benefited from his business dealings for years. They whispered that Thomas was a weak-willed boy, easily coerced by a clever sheriff, and that Amelia, with her secret online life and financial troubles, was not the paragon of virtue everyone believed her to be. Sheriff Brody sat through every session, a grim sentinel watching the community he had sworn to protect cannibalize itself. On the stand, he was the picture of professionalism, laying out the evidence piece by piece, his voice a monotone anchor in a sea of emotional turbulence. He presented the timeline, the forensic impossibilities of an accident, and the damning confession of Thomas. But the centerpiece of the trial was Thomas himself. When he took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. He was a ghost of the boy he once was, gaunt and pale, his eyes darting nervously towards his father. Richard sat impassive, his gaze a cold, hard weight that seemed to press down on his son. With a trembling voice, Thomas recounted the events of that night, the escalating argument, the violent shove, the sickening sound of impact, and the cold, terrifying clarity with which his father had orchestrated the cover-up. The cross-examination was brutal. Richard's high-priced lawyer, a shark from the city, tore into Thomas's testimony. He painted him as an unreliable narrator, a troubled young man desperate to shift blame from himself. He brought up every instance of teenage rebellion, every poor grade, every minor transgression, twisting them into a narrative of a resentful son capable of anything. He asked Thomas, "Isn't it true you were the one operating the excavator that day? Isn't it possible you were the one who was careless, who caused this tragedy, and your father, in a misguided act of parental love, tried to protect you?" Each question was a poisoned dart, and though Thomas denied it all, the seeds of doubt were planted in the jury's minds. The prosecution, in a bid to reestablish motive, brought Alex, the online scammer, to the stand. His testimony was meant to show the pressure Amelia was under, but the defense skillfully turned it to their advantage. They used Alex's testimony to paint Amelia as emotionally volatile and financially desperate, a woman capable of making irrational and aggressive demands. The narrative was subtly shifting from Richard's violent rage to Amelia's supposed instability. The verdict, when it came, was a blow that fractured the town completely. Richard was found not guilty of murder. He was convicted on the lesser charge of manslaughter. The jury had been swayed by the defense's argument that it was not a premeditated act but a tragic accident born from a heated crime of passion, rather than of intent. A wave of gasps and sobs swept through one half of the courtroom, while quiet sighs of relief came from the other. Amelia's family collapsed in grief. Sheriff Brody felt a cold, hollow emptiness. Justice had been rendered, but it felt like a grotesque parody of the truth. As Richard was led away to serve a significantly shorter sentence than anyone expected, he cast a look over his shoulder, not at his son, but at the town's elite who had supported him. It was a look of gratitude and of triumph. Thomas was escorted out a side door, his testimony having convicted his father but branded him a pariah in the eyes of many. The trial was over, but for Oak Ridge the real sentence was just beginning. 2 years passed, but the ghost of Amelia Collins still walked the streets of Oak Ridge. The town had not healed, it had scarred. The overt divisions of the trial had settled into a quiet, simmering resentment. Neighbors who had once shared coffees now offered only curt nods. The proposed community garden, Amelia's passion project, never materialized. The plot of land where she died, owned by a holding company now controlled by Richard's associates, sat vacant and overgrown with weeds, a constant, ugly reminder of the tragedy. Sheriff Brody felt the change more than anyone. The case had been the last major investigation of his career, and it had soured him on the job. He saw the whispers and the averted gazes. He knew that half the town saw him as the man who had torn a prominent family apart based on the word of a troubled boy. He was tired, the lines on his face deeper, his optimism eroded. He was counting the days to retirement. Thomas had served a short sentence for his role in the cover-up and had returned not to Oak Ridge, but to a life of anonymity in a neighboring county. He worked a grueling job at a lumber yard, the physical labor a welcome punishment that quieted the noise in his head. He was haunted by the memory of his father's cold eyes in the courtroom and by the knowledge that his testimony, while the truth, had not been enough. He was an outcast, a man without a family or a home. The story, however, was far from over. A new player arrived in Oak Ridge in the form of a young, ambitious true crime podcaster named Sarah Jenkins. Her series, Small Town, Dark Secrets, had a cult following, and she saw the Excavator bucket case as a perfect subject, a seemingly simple story with a deeply unsatisfying conclusion. She was sharp, relentless, and possessed a digital savvy that the Oak Ridge PD had lacked. Sarah began her investigation by re-examining Amelia's life, specifically her finances. Brody had seen the payments to the scammer, Alex, and had stopped there. But Sarah kept digging. She subpoenaed bank records and shell company documents that Brody had never been able to access. And that's when she found it. A secret that had been buried deeper than any body. Weeks before her death, Amelia Collins had taken out a massive personal loan. It wasn't from a bank. It was a private loan, funneled through a series of shell corporations that led directly back to one source: Richard's development company. This discovery changed everything. Why would Amelia, who was being bled dry by an online scammer, take out an even larger loan from the very man she was publicly fighting over a piece of land? It made no sense as a loan. But, as Sarah hypothesized, it made perfect sense as a payment. She uncovered a series of emails from a deleted account belonging to Amelia. In them, Amelia wasn't a victim of blackmail. She was the one applying the pressure. While researching the history of the garden plot, the ever-diligent teacher had stumbled upon evidence of something far more sinister. Richard was using his construction projects as a front for a massive money-laundering scheme. He was washing money for criminals from the city. The documents Amelia had found were proof. The loan wasn't a loan at all. It was Richard's first attempt to buy her silence. The argument on that fateful night wasn't about a community garden. It was about Amelia telling Richard that the hush money wasn't enough, that she was going to the federal authorities. Her death wasn't an accident born from a momentary loss of temper. It was the cold, calculated execution of a witness who was about to bring down a criminal empire. Armed with a mountain of new, irrefutable evidence, Sarah Jenkins went straight to Sheriff Brody. At first, he was skeptical, weary of reopening the wound that had nearly destroyed his town. But as Sarah laid out the bank transfers, the shell company documents, and the damning emails from Amelia's hidden account, his weariness was replaced by a slow-burning fury. He had been right all along, but he had only ever seen the tip of the iceberg. Amelia wasn't just a victim. She had been a hero, fighting a silent battle he never knew existed. The new evidence was enough to secure a warrant. Brody, feeling a renewed sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, drove to the state prison to confront Richard. The man he found was not the powerful, defiant figure from the courtroom. Prison had diminished him. When Brody laid the files on the metal table between them, detailing the money laundering, the fraud, and Amelia's discovery, Richard's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. With nothing left to lose, the real story poured out. He confessed everything. He described how Amelia, this quiet elementary school teacher, had calmly and methodically cornered him with evidence that would put him away for life. He had underestimated her, and it had terrified him. He met her at the site that night not to argue, but to threaten her one last time. When she refused to back down, he knew he had no choice. He pushed her, fully intending to silence her for good. The manslaughter conviction had been a joke, a lucky break he never deserved. The final piece of the puzzle was Thomas. Brody found him living in a small, run-down apartment. He looked older, broken. Brody sat with him and, for the first time, told him the full story. He explained that the argument he had witnessed wasn't just about land. He told him that Amelia wasn't just a victim of his father's temper, but a courageous woman who had died trying to expose a massive criminal operation. "Your father wasn't protecting you from an accident, Thomas," Brody said gently. "He was using you to cover up a cold-blooded murder to save himself." For Thomas, this revelation was transformative. The guilt he carried had been for his part in covering up a tragic mistake. The knowledge that he had been a pawn in the deliberate silencing of a brave woman was a different, sharper kind of pain, but it came with a strange clarity. His loyalty had been to a monster, not a father. With Thomas agreeing to testify about his father's state of mind and the true nature of the confrontation, and with the new financial evidence, the district attorney filed new charges against Richard: first-degree murder and a host of federal financial crimes. This time, there would be no leniency. In the end, Oak Ridge got the truth. It was uglier and more complex than they could have imagined, but it was whole. The news of Richard's criminal empire and Amelia's quiet heroism rocked the town, forcing a reevaluation of everything they thought they knew. A year later, the vacant lot was no longer an eyesore. Using assets seized from Richard's criminal enterprise, the town finally built the community garden. It was named the Amelia Collins Memorial Garden. It wasn't a place of sadness, but one of resilience. Sheriff Brody, his retirement postponed, often walked through the garden in the evenings. He would sometimes see Thomas there, quietly tending to a plot of vegetables, a tentative peace on his face. He was slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding a life. The town was healing, not by forgetting the horror, but by finally understanding the truth of the woman they had lost, not a simple, perfect saint, but a complex, flawed, and profoundly brave human being who had fought for the soul of their town and, in the process, had unearthed a truth that finally allowed it to grow again.